Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you today.
How are we this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing well.
Good.
So we'll attack a couple of problems here and solve them, of course, or postpone them. We'll make a suggestion. We'll postpone the final decision for a later date. But I want to start off by talking a little bit about the court case. That's still big in the news.
Yeah.
But I think there was an attitude shift for me just looking at the news and trying to figure out how other people be. And, you know, there was some noise from the Republicans, fight, 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 and do all this. Then I think it settled down for a day or two, and people, but the media has a lot to do with this image, because they were getting down to the point where Republicans are saying they're sort of split. They're saying we shouldn't find out if there's any fraud or not.
Yeah.
But you know, I think the statement that McConnell made the other day was a decent statement. He talked to Barr and he came out, and he plays the role of not being a demagogue, and McConnell said, you know, everything that he's asking, everything we do is legal and it's constitutional. He's not asking for anything. Here it is, A, B, C, D. It's legal. It's been used before, and try to calm down that, because the Democrats want to demagogue, you know, and just ridicule, you know, Trump for being. The only thing is most people in the country now think, well, yeah, he lost, Trump lost, he's a sore loser, and that's why he's doing that. And there's lots of problems in analyzing that, but there's lots of problems with people who may have participated in a lot of fraud and may be arguing in the case that you don't prosecute fraud if it's to our benefit. So that's where they are. But I think you know, there's been some rulings now, and it's moving along. The Pennsylvania case is being you know, challenged, and they're allowing more information to be made. And Alito had a favorable ruling that sort of opens up the door to counting the votes. You know, they're segregating the votes now of everybody that voted before the polls closed, and the absentee ballots. They were separating those two, which makes sense. Is try to sort it out. Maybe he'll come across that bundle. Oh, what's this bundle say? Oh, we don't have to count them because they all say the same thing. That's the one that came in at 4 a.m. But anyway, I think that's going to continue. But if anything, I think, you know, from Trump's point of view and a Republican point of view, they're probably doing as much as they can under the circumstances of the media being so 100% opposed and demagoguing and making fun. And of course, the orchestration of it to me was pretty impressive, that everybody, you know, announced, or, you know, all the states at the end there are 6 or 7 states announced, you know, the vote, which is unusual. Usually they come in one state at a time, but they all announced, and that was in, and you weren't supposed to talk about it, because from then on, Biden was the president-elect. So they have been able to coordinate that, and it's very, very powerful. But it remains to be seen on whether there will be enough question about how authentic the vote was and how honest it was, and whether there was significant fraud. And I think it's important that they do it. I don't think I'm going to bet money on exactly what the outcome will be on the short run. But I know in the long run, if there is the fraud that is suspected, if it's not documented and people know about this, you know, it's just going to get much, much worse. You combine this with the permanency of the changes being made with coronavirus, you know, and the lockdown, and you put this together with elections, and you say, oh, well, you know, you don't have to check it out even if it looks like fraud. So I think it's very, very important. It'll be interesting to see if Trump gets any more support than the media is pretending he's getting now. Like they say, he's really not. The Republicans are giving up on him.
Well, they want us to believe that if the shoe were on the other foot, and Joe Biden had been widely ahead in Pennsylvania, amazingly ahead in Pennsylvania, the key state to the presidency, and somehow the counting was stopped in the middle of the night, and somehow when you woke up the next morning, it was all in for Trump, and Trump had taken it. They want us to believe that Biden would have said, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? This is the key to my presidency. Something very fishy is going on. There's nobody in his or her right mind who doesn't believe that the Democrats would have and should have gone after it if that were the case. So this is really a kind of a gaslighting thing. But here's the thing we talked about just before we started, this kind of a funny aside. Okay, the elections results have not been certified. The only place where Biden is confirmed to be president-elect is the mainstream media. But a lot of the mainstream media is attacking Russia for why haven't you recognized Biden? Why haven't you recognized Biden? The irony, of course, is that would be meddling in our elections by recognizing him as president-elect before he's even been certified. Here's a couple of quick updates as we start. Today, Trump finally wins Alaska. For some reason, it took them a long time, over a week, to count the votes up there. Maybe they were frozen solid. Yesterday, Trump won North Carolina. The Republicans have now gained at least 50 Senate seats, so one more and they'll control the majority in the Senate. At the very least, it'll be a tide. In Georgia, the Secretary of State, just before we came on, announced that a hand recount of the presidential race will be taken. There's less than 20,000 votes separating Trump and Biden on that, so a hand recount could be significant. So these are the things, this is why we did this headline this way. These are things that are happening that we're watching. Of course, the media is engaged in a massive psyop, saying if you don't accept these results, you are a bad and evil person.
I can see where the psychology of this whole thing would shift quickly if, as the votes were coming in and it looked like they had to pause a bit and gather their thoughts, and all of a sudden there was a bundle of votes. What happens if there's a bundle of discoveries?
Yeah.
All of a sudden the whole psychology of this will change, even though the media will say, oh, it's all fudged again. But I mentioned yesterday about the election chief, in Justice Department, who's in charge of any corruption in election. And I mentioned the fact that Richard Pilger resigned immediately. And the question is why? And they sort of wanted to make you think that it's because Barr was opening this up and using the word fraud. And I don't even know if he did use the fraud, but obviously it was to check because there's been accusations and see if there is fraud, which they have a right to do. But he resigned, and they made it sound like he was sort of above the fray. But it also turns out that he's a very suspicious character. I mentioned yesterday he's the one that prosecuted some of my staff members and took maybe at the most a misdemeanor and turned it into a criminal case, and it was very, very deadly. But Bilger is interesting, and he really needs something. Maybe somebody will really investigate him, because he worked close, and this is public knowledge, he worked closely with Lois Lerner.
Yeah.
And if you think of crooked election, he's in charge of stopping crazy.
Yeah.
So what were they doing? They were intimidating, a few years ago, and I think one of my organizations was attacked by it in a modest way, but they're saying that the IRS comes after you. Matter of fact, they did it twice where we had to go through hoops to not lose our status. And he was buddies with them, buddies with her, and they worked it out who and how they were going to attack him. So some people think, well, maybe he doesn't want exposure. Maybe that's why he just sort of found it more than he could take, be exposed for doing exactly what he's pretending that he's trying to prevent over all these years.
The sad thing is he just went to another place in the Justice Department. He's still getting his paycheck. We're still paying his salary. Crooked guy. We put up on RonPaulInstitute.org website a great article from our good friend Jacob Hornberger talking about what's the big deal if the president wants to investigate the results of the election. And he points out that the other side says it's false and baseless to suspect the results of the election. But as he says, secrecy is the core of fraud. So there wouldn't be necessarily overt evidence. So what if there's something to the allegations of software fraud? The mainstream media says because there's no immediate evidence, it's not worth investigating. But there wouldn't necessarily be immediate evidence if it's being covered up. And the other point that Jacob makes is that the mainstream media ignores the massive influx of Biden votes that came in after the vote count stopped on election night. And Jacob says it was unusual. Nothing like this has happened in U.S. presidential electoral history. So what is the big deal about wanting to see what happened? If it's on the up and up, fine. January 20th, President Biden. Why between now and then are they having a panic attack about even looking into it? What do they have to hide?
You know, I was implying that maybe there was a little lackadaisical effort and with other Republicans to support, the investigation on whether or not there was fraud. But there's the amicus brief that was filed by 10 state attorney generals, and of course they're all Republicans. But that gives it some ammunition. They're not the kind that deserted Trump even when he was a candidate and deserted him when he was president, and now really desert him and say that they represent the Republican Party. That's hardly the case. The people who represent the Republican Party right now are still in office, and it's going to be, I think, really, if you're just looking at where the country's going and what's happening politically, it's going to be Georgia. Boy, the Republican could lose 2 seats, or they could pick up 2 seats. With the numbers where they are now, so that'll be an interesting race. There's going to be a lot of money spent down there.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the attorneys general are interested in looking into the Pennsylvania case, which we've talked about before, which is a legitimate case that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court unilaterally changes the voting rules, which they have no constitutional authority to do according to the United States Constitution, and that's what they're interested in. I wanted to bring up a couple quick things, Dr. Paul, that I noticed. So this is the main thing that the Democrats are doing now, is saying we have to put our differences aside. We have to get together. Well, they're doing the opposite. And, the Lincoln Project was founded by a bunch of neocon Republicans who wanted to defeat Trump. Here's what they did yesterday. On one hand, they're putting out things about how we've got to accept the results and get together. They put out a tweet yesterday doxing 2 of the Trump lawyers in Pennsylvania. And what that means is giving personal information about them, including contact information, out in public on Twitter. And that is strictly forbidden in Twitter. Here's what they did. There are 2 attorneys who involved. Their tweet said, "These are the 2 attorneys attempting to overturn the will of the Pennsylvanian people." And it gave their name, phone number, and email, personal information. "Make them famous," they said. And they added a skull and crossbones after that, which I think clearly is a threat. The Lincoln Project was not suspended. It was not kicked off Twitter. And I've been kicked off Twitter, as you know, Dr. Paul. I wasn't threatening anyone. I was just making fun of Hannity. So there you have it, non-suspended for literally threatening. And here's another one. The Trump Accountability Project was set up by former Obama administration officials and staffers. And they are making a list of Trump administration officials to try to keep them from getting any future job. And you talked about this before, but here's a former Obama spokesperson, Hari Savagani. Here's what he said about what they're trying to do. "White House staffers are starting to look for jobs. Employers considering them should know there are consequences for hiring anyone who helped Trump attack American values." That's something straight out of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, this idea that we have to come together and look past our differences, that is so much garbage, really, because exactly the opposite is, I think, necessary. That was the argument that the dictators used, the Soviets used it, and they would use it, and actually people would be convinced. They said, "We're for peace, we're for peace." Yeah, on whose terms? On whose terms they are. And this also invites an analysis of all this idea that, well, the country would be so much better off if we just had moderation, bring people together, and show that the Republicans and the Democrats can work together. It all depends on what they're coming together on. If they're coming together to spend money or start a war, it's the evil, thing. And that's what they do. They say, you come together. But does that mean you ignore the people who disagree? I approach it with the idea that there's hardly ever 2 people that's going to agree on every single thing. And what you do is you come together on the things that you agree on, and I see it as coalition building.
Yeah.
And I was pleased personally with myself being able to, talk to liberal Democrats, a principled one that believed in something, and you could consistently, and they were willing to talk. It's because there are some progressive liberal Democrats, probably not the progressives anymore, but a liberal Democrat that respects civil liberties, and privacy. And this to me is very important. Some would be this way on the war, but that is not the same as just look past our differences and let's have a moderation, let's have bipartisanship, and to agree on both sides to sacrifice what they believe in. It's almost the opposite of trying to build a coalition with people who agree on the right kind of issues.
That's right. And you know, should they look into this? Why should they get the American people to be comfortable with the results? Well, here's one reason. Let's look at this first clip. This is a new poll by Morning Consult, which found that 7 in 10 Republicans say the election was neither free nor fair. Look at that among Republicans, how they view the electoral process and what happened last week. That's a serious crisis in confidence. Let's look at the next one now. Democrat trust in elections rises as Republican trust plummets. And you see what's happened. So you have a huge amount of Republicans, 7 in 10, who don't believe it was free and fair. You have things like the fake polls showing Biden up by 17 points in Wisconsin, while in reality they finished neck and neck. That's a blatant mainstream media attempt to vote suppress, because people are not going to get out to vote if they see there's really no hope for their candidate winning. So this is why it has to be looked into if the other side does care about people continuing to buy into the system.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because it sort of challenges what I was saying at the beginning, that the media now is painting a picture that Republicans are rolling over and we have to come together and you know, work together and quit challenging it. But you know, the 70% of the Republicans, you know, specifically, you know, are unhappy and think it's not fair. So
that's pretty
the
serious.
whole thing, right?
Well, let's move on to a little bit of coronavirus stuff. And Jeff Tucker had a good piece in AEIR, American Institute of Economic Research, reaffirming what we've suspected a long time, but very large study in the UK, the largest ever study of COVID risk to adults from contact with children. The science says, you know, talk about the science, based on this large study, there's no increase in severe COVID-related outcomes for adults living with children. There's a small increase in infections, but without bad outcome. The study found actually fewer deaths associated with adults living with children than adults living without children. So what this says is that the policies that were put into place in March, close the schools, nobody can go out. There's no evidence that they worked at the time they were called, and there's no evidence that they work now. There's no evidence that they did anything. On the contrary, as you've said many times, they have caused much more harm than good.
Right, and in looking at the children, how much damage has been done, but he also made a strong point that women have suffered as well on this, because they might be having their kids at daycare and have a job. They lose their job, and you know, it's just compounding. So it's caused a lot of harm. Jeff has written this in the AIER, American Institute for Economic Research, and Jeff worked for me at one time, and I think he's been doing a very good job on reporting on this. When he finds it, he will dissect it out, but he was very good at showing this. But we have to remember, this is United Kingdom. Every once in a while we find countries that were way ahead of us harming our people, but sometimes we're getting way behind others who are getting sick and tired of it. So it's a shame that we don't have more of this type of research here. I guess you have to go to Florida to find somebody really thinking about reversing the trend. And it is disturbing when you also come across people who are very negative and say, it'll never be the same again, and what they're saying, it'll never be decent again. It'll never protect your civil liberties, and it's going to be changed forever. You know, major changes are pretty interesting, and it should be. And I think in 1776 there was a major change and a major emphasis, which was a reflection of an understanding of liberty and individualism, which was alive and well by a lot of people who wrote about this before the founders. The founders didn't invent this. That's what's the magnificent thing, I think, about the founders, how well educated they were. So I hope these people who are now saying we can never restore an emphasis on civil liberties. I want to advance it. I don't care if it's not restored specifically. I tell people, do you want to go back to our gold standard? No, not necessarily. It was less than perfect, and it wasn't really a libertarian monetary system.
Yeah.
So I don't like the word about going back, but which way are you going? You have to know what people believe in, and that to me is the most important thing.
Well, speaking of these demons who say you can never have your life back, let's look at the next. This is the poster child for evil, in my view. This is Klaus Schwab. The world will never return to normal after COVID. Now, who the heck is he to tell us how we can live? Well, he's the founder of the World Economic Forum. He's just a guy who founded a think tank that all the rich people go to and sit around planning our lives for us. Let's look at a quote from this guy. What a monster. This next one, let's have a look at that. Here's what he said. Many of us are pondering when things will return to normal. The short response is never. Nothing will ever return to the broken sense of normalcy that prevailed prior to the crisis, because the coronavirus pandemic marks a fundamental inflection point in our global trajectory, blah, blah, blah. And here's what he says as well. Unlike certain past epidemics, COVID-19 doesn't pose a new existential threat. So here's saying two things. It's not a big deal compared to stuff we've had in the past, but never mind. You can never have your lives back again. I'm going to plan your life for you from now on. What a creep.
I see Biden has a plan to deal with unemployment if it ever come back again. If they admitted it, the underemployment is very, very high, and of course that problem is going to be around with it. But he has a solution. He's going to hire 100,000 of them, and they're going to be in charge of tracking people. And they call them, the word they use for this, so these are people who are cultural competent.
Oh, great.
They have to know what they're doing, and they have to know why you talk to people and where you're going and what did you do here. And they're going to have 100,000 people. It's like a police force out there. But I think that hopefully is seen as over the top, as it should be. But it never seems to slow up, no matter how ridiculous it is, no matter how much fun you make of it. It seems like they can go the next day and go back to it again. I mean, people don't learn their lessons about foreign policy. They don't understand privacy issues. And also, right now, they seem to be slow learners about masks on people and the way they treat kids and lockdowns that has been so detrimental. And people now, the big argument now is what we're talking about. Can we get back? And these so-called experts are saying, no, you can't, forget it. We're in charge now. This is a new era. I'd like a new era, but I'd like to be in charge of describing what the new era could look like if we did the right thing.
Well, there's a lot of people in this country that are ticked off over the elections. I would hate to be one of these culturally competent busybodies going around places, maybe even like Brazoria County, telling people we got to track you, we got to trace you. It's not going to be a fun job. They're going to have some, even though they pretend they're culturally competent, they're going to have some muscle and some armor if they come down to places like this. But you mentioned a little bit about Biden's potential policy on employment. There's also an article written by Caitlin Johnstone, who spoke at one of our conferences, on the kinds of people he's going to bring in on his foreign policy. And you and I, there are a couple of areas where we praised Obama. I think even those couple of bright spots in the Obama foreign policy will be completely washed away when it comes to the Biden foreign policy. And the reason being that Obama's worst foreign policy people are coming out in droves and expecting top positions in a Biden foundation, in a Biden administration. People like Michelle Flournoy is being floated as Secretary of Defense. Love the Iraq War. She's the engineer behind the butchery in Libya and Syria. Loved that one. She got out of government, went to work for a military contractor. She makes $500,000 a year. Susan Rice, Secretary of State. All that above and more. And in fact, when you want to see what the Biden foreign policy may look like, let's have a look at this final clip that I have up. This will tell you pretty much all you need to know. Here's Susan Rice having an intimate moment with the head of the Mossad. So there you go. There you go. And then Avril Haines for the CIA. She's the person who protected CIA torturers, the people that were named in the Senate investigation of torture. She protected them from getting prosecuted.
You know, the propaganda continues that we have to deal with. We worked real hard to try to get the definition straight about infections and cases and all the distortions. And finally, the CDC and others admitted to their mistakes, but it never seems to change their attitude. They still pump this stuff out. And there's one here this week that I thought, oh boy, here it goes again. I wonder if it could be true. Is it really happening? This is scary stuff, and we better be careful, and we better know what we're talking about. It says, with Illinois' COVID-19 cases soaring, officially reported information is increasingly useless. So the writer here, Mark Glennon, it was on Zero Hedge, he went through it, and I thought he was, very objective to doing it. He didn't come across and say automatically everything they say, that there is absolutely nothing to it. But he said that the way they interpreted those statistics, once again, those projections and all, it's completely false. There's no way that we should be reading headlines about the cases are soaring. Numbers are soaring. A lot of times the cases are soaring, which is not mean anybody's sick and not mean that the death rate's going up, not mean hospitalization is going up, but they get the headline, and if people weren't scared, why would they put those masks on? You have to be scared.
Yeah.
You're scared to do that, and you don't want to hurt other people. If this is the case, I won't do it for myself, but I got to protect other people. And this whole idea about protecting little kids now, the younger they are, the more likely they are can suffer some consequences from wearing a mask. I mean, it's obstruction to our breathing apparatus, to breathe in, and the whole thing is there's lots of oral problems and skin problems that develop from masks, especially with the kids.
Yeah. Well, we live in an era where people rarely get beyond the headlines. The social media, I think, has done a lot of that. People rarely will settle down, spend 10 or 15 minutes reading an article. So that's why it's so important that these scare headlines are out there, because most people never get beyond them. The thing about the flu, the thing about these spikes and everything we talked about before, the CDC itself says we're not even going to track the flu this year. We don't even care about it. So that means anyone who's sick will be COVID. We were meeting with some of our supporters after our conference in the weekend. He told an interesting story. He walked into a hotel here in Lake Jackson without a mask on, and the woman at the desk had a panic attack. Put your mask on, put your mask on. And he said, yeah, they don't do any good anyway. She said, but I've got a child at home I have to worry about. He said, kids don't have any chance of getting it or getting sick. It didn't. So this is how propagandized people are. This is how brain damaged they are from endless propaganda. But I'm gonna close out if we're done, unless you want to say something first.
No, we have hinted around that we want to get caught up on current events around the world, and we won't do that today. But that is something. I mean, there is going to be a change in foreign policy, and you're aware of some of the new people that may come in, new people who are part of the deep state. So we'll do that, but we're going to keep an eye on that, because, quite frankly, I don't think rhetoric changes, but policies generally don't.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a special closing. I just want to reiterate what Dr. Paula said. Our numbers have really increased over this past week. To us, that says you want to hear an alternative analysis. You want to hear some facts-based information and analysis, and we appreciate that. And it gives us the energy to work twice as hard to try to put something together that's coherent and that helps inform and does the job that journalism should do. So we appreciate more of you watching us. Also, I encourage you to go to ronpaulinstitute.org, subscribe to our updates. We don't bombard you like a lot of places do, but we'll occasionally send something out that updates what's happening. Of course, we never sell, rent, or give your name away. It's only for us. But we want to be able to get in touch, because one never knows with the censorship and social media, one never knows when they may take all of you from us. So it would be nice to be able to get in touch, and thank all of you for watching.
Good. And I too want to thank our viewers for tuning in each day and encouraging us. I think that there's no doubt that we're doing better in reaching more people, and that's thanks to all of you. But the way we have to do this is we're not going to get control of the media. We're not going to get control of our universities. We're not going to get control of our schools. We're not going to get control of the infiltration of the Marxist viewpoints into almost every political group in the country. but we do have an obligation to try to understand there's still enough freedom to read and study and realize where the problems are. And to me, they're always, they're always dealing with some type of a philosophic issue, and there's always a philosophic point behind it. These individuals who now are into our Congress, and they don't care about being called communists. They don't even seem to deny that they're Marxists or anything. But I'll tell you what, they've been looking at this for a long time. They just didn't pop up last week and read one article and say, oh, I'd like to be a Marxist. No, it's well organized and trained. We have to do the same thing. We have to educate people to why it's beneficial. You know, I can explain a lot of times why things are economically better, but I don't think people will change their mind unless they say, you know, it is better for me to live in a free society. So it has to be personal. Wouldn't you like to have your life back again? Wouldn't you like to be able to spend your money the way that you want? Wouldn't you like to be able to pick your religion without being coerced by the government? It's on and on. It should be a very personal thing. But then when it's beneficial, the wonderful thing about it is that everybody's going to use their freedom slightly differently. So it isn't the issue on how you're going to use your freedom. It's the idea of everybody coming together and say, we all like our freedom and we have to convert people voluntarily. So argumentatively trying to change the status quo is very, very difficult. The other day I was in a store and I was in a few minutes, and then of course the police came, the so-called police came, and my wife was with me, and they said, you don't have your mask on, you don't have your mask on. And I said, well, really they don't do that much good, you know. And she kept pestering me, and finally I wouldn't argue with her, and finally I got disgusted with it because I had to end, and I said, do you want me to leave? And total silence. Total silence. So that approach worked for me under those circumstances because they would have had to say, I want you to leave despite the fact that you seem to not be a dangerous person. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to confront them and say it. But I think that one thing that I know is that you don't convert people to certain beliefs by really, you know, badgering and think that you can grab them and saying, look, this is what you should believe, and you have to do this. But they have to be persuaded, and that's the way a free society works. It is through persuasion and through voluntarism, and why it's in their best interest to live in a free country and have their freedoms protected. That's what we have to emphasize. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.